on a winter night in Paris. Inside a theater that had sold every seat weeks in advance, Edith Piaf did something no one in the room expected. Halfway through the concert, in the middle of a song the whole audience had come to hear, she simply stopped. The orchestra behind her faltered and went quiet. The last note hung in the air and then dissolved into nothing. For a few seconds, the theater held its breath, unsure whether the small woman in the black dress had forgotten the words, or fallen ill, or lost her nerve. She had done none of those things. Slowly, she walked to the very edge of the stage, past the footlights, close enough that the front row could see her hands trembling. And then she began to sing again, quietly this time, almost privately, to a single man sitting alone in the front row. Nobody in that theater knew who he was. Not the ushers, not the orchestra, not the journalists in the balcony taking notes. For the rest of the night, Edith Piaf sang to that one silent stranger as if the other 2,000 people had simply vanished. The question that everyone carried home with them, the question that outlived the concert itself, was this: who was he, and what did she see in his face that made the greatest voice in France turn away from an entire audience? To understand what happened that night, you have to understand the world Edith Piaf came from. She had not been handed the stage. She had been born into the hardest corners of Paris, raised in poverty, and had learned to sing on street corners where the only applause was a few coins dropped into a hat. By the years of her fame, the Paris she performed in was a city rebuilding itself, hungry for beauty after everything it had lost. The great concert halls glowed again. The Olympia filled night after night. And in those halls, Edith Piaf was not simply a singer. She was something closer to a confessor. When she sang, people did not lean back in their seats and admire her. They leaned forward, because it felt as if she were telling the truth about their own lives. Her voice was not delicate. It was enormous, raw, carved out of hardship, and yet it could drop to a whisper that made a room of thousands feel like a small kitchen at midnight. That was the paradox of her performances. She stood in front of vast crowds, and yet every person in those crowds believed, somehow, that she was singing to them alone. They came in their good coats, the men in dark suits, the women with their hair set carefully, and they sat in the dark, waiting to feel something they could not always name. Some of them had loved her since the earliest recordings, played on scratched gramophones during years when there was very little else to hold on to. For them, her voice was not entertainment. It was a thread that ran back through their whole lives, tying the person they were now to the person they had once been. Most nights, that belief, that she was singing for you and no one else, was a beautiful illusion, generously shared with everyone in the room. But on this particular night, in front of a sold-out house, the illusion would become something literal, something almost unbearable to watch. By this point in her life, Edith Piaf was no longer the young girl who had once sung for strangers on the pavement. She had loved and lost. She had known grief that would have silenced most people forever, and she carried the weight of it onto every stage she walked. Those close to her knew that she often sang while she was in pain, that some nights she could barely stand before the curtain rose, and that she refused, again and again, to cancel. The stage was the one place where her suffering became something other than suffering. It became music. On the night of this concert, she had arrived tired, Backstage, she was quieter than usual. She did not joke with the musicians the way she often did. She sat with her hands folded, looking at nothing, gathering herself the way she always had before a performance. When she finally stepped into the light, the audience rose. The applause rolled over her like a wave. For the first half of the concert, everything was as it should be. She was luminous. She was in complete control. She gave them the songs they had come for, and the theater answered her with a devotion that bordered on love. She moved through the program the way she always did, letting each song build on the last, drawing the room deeper into the world she was making out of nothing but her voice and the light. The musicians behind her knew every breath she took. They had learned to follow the smallest tilt of her head, the way her fingers opened at the end of a phrase. To them, she was not unpredictable. She was a language they had spent years learning to read. And then, somewhere in the middle of the evening, without warning, her eyes moved across the front row and stopped. The man she had noticed was not remarkable to look at. He sat alone, in a plain coat, in a seat that someone had clearly reserved for him with care. He was older. His hands rested still in his lap. He did not applaud with the others. He did not call out her name. He simply watched her, with an expression that no one else in the theater seemed to notice. It was the face of a man who was not there to be entertained. He was there to remember something. There are people who come to a concert to be seen, and people who come to escape. And then there are the rare few who come because a certain voice is tied to the most important moments of their lives. Edith Piaf had spent her whole career reading faces from the stage. She could tell, within seconds, who in a crowd was truly listening and who was merely present. And in this man's stillness, she recognized something she could not turn away from. Grief, perhaps, or memory, or a love that had ended and never healed. Whatever it was, she saw it plainly, the way only someone who had carried the same weight could see it in another. She knew that face. Not the man, perhaps, but the expression, the particular stillness of someone who has come not to forget their pain for an evening, but to sit close to it, to let a song press on the exact place that still hurt. She had worn that face herself, in the dark, on nights when only music could reach her. And now she was looking at it from the other side of the footlights. And in that moment, the concert stopped belonging to the audience. It began, quietly, to belong to him. What made the next few minutes so extraordinary was not drama. It was silence. Edith Piaf did not announce anything. She did not explain herself to the crowd. She simply let the song she was singing come to a natural pause. And then she did not begin the next one. The orchestra, watching her, held their instruments and waited. The conductor lowered his hands. 2,000 people, who had come expecting a flawless, uninterrupted performance, slowly realized that something unplanned was happening in front of them, something none of them had been promised, something that could not be repeated. A murmur passed through the theater and then died away, because everyone sensed at the same time that this was not a mistake to be embarrassed by. It was a decision. Edith Piaf took a breath, and instead of turning back toward the center of the stage where the light was strongest, she walked forward. She crossed the invisible line that every performer respects, the line between the artist and the crowd, and she stopped at the very lip of the stage, directly above the man in the front row. Ushers at the back of the hall stopped moving. A woman in the third row reached for the hand of the person beside her without quite knowing why. The whole theater leaned in, and for the first time all night, no one was sure what they were about to see. When she began to sing again, her voice was different. It was smaller, not weaker, smaller. The way a voice becomes when it is meant for one person and not for a hall. She was not projecting to the back rows anymore. She was not reaching for the balconies. She had gathered all that enormous power she was famous for and folded it down into something intimate, something that the man in the front row could have heard even if the theater had been empty. He did not move. But those near enough to see his face later said that his eyes filled slowly, and that he did not look away from her, not once, not for the length of an entire song. She sang to him as if she were answering a question he had never asked out loud, as if she knew exactly what he had lost and was telling him, in the only language she had ever trusted, that she understood. There was no performance left in it now. There was only one person telling another that they were not alone, and doing it the only way she had ever known how, with a melody, and the whole weight of a life behind it. Around them, 2,000 strangers sat perfectly still, holding a silence so complete that people would describe it for years afterward as the quietest they had ever heard a full theater become. No one coughed. No one whispered. They understood, without being told, that they were witnessing something not meant for them, and that its beauty was exactly that it was not meant for them. For the rest of the concert, Edith Piaf did not go back. She stayed at the edge of the stage. Song after song she sang down to the one silent man, as though he were the only listener she had ever wanted. The great voice that had filled the largest halls in the world narrowed itself deliberately to the size of a single human heart. And the strangest part, the part that people struggled to explain afterward, was that it did not shrink the night. It made it larger. 2,000 people, watching a performance that was not addressed to them, felt more spoken to than they ever had in their lives. Because each of them, in that hush, thought of their own front-row stranger, the person they had loved and lost, the face they still looked for in crowds, the one they wished they could sing to one last time. Edith Piaf had taken a private act of tenderness and, without meaning to, had handed the entire theater a mirror. When the last song ended, she did not bow immediately. She looked at the man for a long moment, and he looked back at her, and something passed between them that no one else would ever fully understand. Then the theater rose, not with the roar of an ordinary ovation, but slowly, almost reverently, as if applause itself felt too loud for what had just happened. No one ever confirmed who the man in the front row was. Some said he was an old love. Some said he was a friend from the years before her fame, from the streets where she had first learned to sing. Some believed he had lost someone she had also known, and that she was singing not only to him, but to a memory they shared. Edith Piaf never explained it. When people asked, she would only say that she had sung to someone who needed it, and she would leave it there. Perhaps that was the truest answer she could give, because in the end, this was who she really was. Not the tragic figure the world liked to imagine,
not a woman defined only by her sorrows, but an artist who understood, better than almost anyone, that a song is not a performance. It is a gift, and a gift has to be given to someone.
That night she gave it to a single stranger, and in doing so she reminded a room full of people why her voice had ever mattered in the first place. Years later, those who were there could not always remember which songs she sang, but they never forgot the sight of the greatest voice in France walking to the edge of the stage, leaving an entire audience behind, and singing the rest of the night to one silent man no one else could name. They had thought they knew Edith Piaf, but they had never heard this story.